You have my name there, Maribel Marrero Colon. It's actually Maribel Bárbara Marrero Colon Sánchez Melenda Adame Martínez Sotomayor Fierro. It's about 5 generations there. So talk about translanguaging and bringing family and culture together. So give you a little bit of background because I don't know about you, but I'm the type of person that I like to know who's talking to me and thinks they know what to tell me. So give you a little bit of background. I am a native New Yorker. I've had a couple of people already today tell me that they can hear my Brooklyn accent. 37 years in education. Started inner city Brooklyn, New York, and my background is in bilingual education, bilingual special education, ESL, you name it, I've taught it. I have taught every single grade from pre-K special ed through adults at various universities and colleges. So I've had really great training, but one of the most important things in understanding the topic of translanguaging is the fact that I've been working with students who are second language learners for 37 years. And so to give you a little bit of background and understand, we're actually going to do a quick survey, think, pair, share. Now, we've all done pair shares in school, right? There's actually 10 different types of pair shares. So survey, think, pair, share is actually, you have to read something first before we talk. So everyone has a handout, and I'm also going to put it up on the board. So survey the example of translanguaging found in your handout. It's a little case scenario. Think about how language is being used in this scenario, and how much is it just natural use of language. So then you're going to pair up with someone, and you're going to share your observations. Then we're going to ask you to share a little bit with us. So I'm going to give you about 3 minutes to read. I'm going to put the first part, and then I'll switch to the second part, but you have them in your handouts. So be my guest. Everybody's eyes on me. Gotta love Harry Wong's first days of school, gotta tell you. Okay, who would like to share? Who would like to share something their partner said? See, now you gotta turn around and say, "What'd you say?" Okay, who would like to share something their partner said that answers either one of these questions, or your own observations?
Oh, just one second. I'm so sorry. No, sorry. ADA compliance.
I guess what we discussed on the deliberation of the teacher's planning is putting him with a group where he can be bilingual in both, and he's being aided and helped in the English aspect of writing for the final report kind of thing. He could take from them, and then knowing that he is bilingual, allowing him to use his strengths in writing in Spanish. So he can feel a part of the group and having that process being done and not just done for him. He's using it in his own language and using that.
Absolutely. Anyone else want to share something their partner said?
I'm waiting for people to make eye contact with me. They're all avoiding me. Okay, wait, okay.
I think it's the microphone that intimidates people. It just felt organic, the way that it was done, where it wasn't, we were talking about how teachers want students to fit inside of a box rather than calling into like what they're comfortable with for student outcome, like their own outcome. And the end result was him creating the lab report in English. So he did what he needed. He scaffolded himself pretty much, but the teacher allowed that to happen and gave him that space to not check his identity at the door.
That's a great point. And I love the fact that you said organic, because bilingual people, we automatically switch over without thinking. You're ever in a group of people and you're all talking one language, somebody comes in that speaks a second language, and everybody just switches and doesn't even know they've done it. And part of this that's really important, and I wanted to point out here, he then rewrites the final draft of the lab report, not a translation. We want him to use language, not translate, because translation doesn't work. Translation has its place, but not as a central part of the learning. Translation is for the directions, for the objectives, to check on comprehension, to introduce something brand new. But that doesn't mean that he's going to write the lab report and then translate it word for word, because we know for a fact that that doesn't work. Okay, so these are the objectives for today of what I want to talk about. We want to define translanguaging, and we're going to look at it two ways. Once as part of daily discourse and as a pedagogical practice. Discuss and describe the different perspectives of translanguaging, because there's quite a few debates on this, and then how can we use it in different classroom programs. That's really important, because it may not work in a particular program. You can't force the issue. You use it as a scaffold. So let's talk about, we just did the survey. Let's define translanguaging. Okay, oh, before that, I want to talk a little bit about demographics. Okay, quickly put, percentage of students who are identified as English learners by state. Now, you know as well as I do, the government's always a couple of years behind in their stats while they get it together. But here's the thing. The lighter in color, the less English learners you have. The darker the color, the more English learners. I think it's the other way around. Lighter the color, the more English learners. So take a look at the map of the United States. Any surprises here? Yeah, Washington State, look at that. 11.8% English learner.
Is that Illinois?
Illinois is over here, 12%. Take a look at Alaska, 11%. And here's the thing about Alaska. This is pure immigration. It does not include First People. Russian, Ukraine. By the way, Fairbanks has a ton of Puerto Ricans. The pipeline. They've actually bring in engineers to Fairbanks. Now, why you would go from 90 degrees to 90 below, I don't know. But here's the thing. You see over here, South Dakota, only 4.8? That's a 600% rise in the past 25 years. Why? The new pipeline. So I actually have cousins who have moved up there to the Dakotas. Again, why you would go from 90 to 90 below? Hey. But you have to stop and think. In Alaska, and look at Hawaii, which is growing, it's almost 10%. They're not all Spanish speakers. Matter of fact, the #1 language in Hawaii is Marshallese and Chuki and Tagalog and very, very few Latinos. Funny thing is most of them are Puerto Rican. Florida. New York's gone down. New York used to be over 11%. So people are moving from one part of the country to another. Texas has gone down. Texas went from close to 29% to 20%. California has come way down from 32%. That's because they're all moving to Texas. But it also has to do. Now, if you stop and think, right now, there's 4.963 million English learners in this country. But here's the thing. These numbers are deceptive. Why? Because these numbers don't include former English learners. So everybody who passed a proficiency test last year are no longer part of this, these numbers. Parochial schools, private charter schools. Public charter schools are in these numbers, but not private charter schools. Kids who are bilingual but have never been identified. Kids like me. That Spanish was my first language, but I always went to school in English. This also does not include students whose parents choose not to have services. So 4.9, it's probably closer to 5.1. Now something happened during COVID. 2019, 2021, the numbers went down. We were actually over 5 million in 2019. So, you know, we lost kids because kids dropped out of school. I'm sorry to say mortality. and more kids passed the proficiency tests. Also, some of the proficiency tests have been rewritten. If you take a look at some of the dips back here, where it went down and up, and that has to do with the changes in the tests. So, are these numbers absolute? No. Are they a good indicator of trends? Absolutely. By the way, here's Pennsylvania. And you also went down during COVID. Not by many, but you did go down. And by the way, if you're wondering where to find this information, there is the U.S. Department of Education National Center for Education Statistics. It is always the same table. I don't care what year. It is always table 204.20. So that's like, it will always be that same table. It's been the same table for 25 years. But if you want to see trends, this is a really great piece. This is from the 2022 statistics. Okay, so think about this. You're looking at these trends, at this data. What correlations do you see with your own schools and districts now? Think about home now. Okay, what don't you see? What's missing? For example, I don't have, because I don't work at any particular school district, I don't have access to the information on socioeconomics. I would love to see the numbers with socioeconomics. And who are your English learners? What are the languages they speak? The United States has well over, I think it's 330 to 480 languages spoken in the United States. So what languages? Countries of origin, where are the kids coming from? Educational background. The kids' educational background as well as the educational background of the parents. We can't assume that all of our parents are illiterate. As a matter of fact, during Hurricane Maria, Orlando received in 1 week 2,500 Puerto Rican students in 1 week, right after Hurricane Maria. 85% of the parents were college educated. Plus, there's a brain drain on the island. And the same thing's happening in the Dominican Republic, and the same thing's happening, believe it or not, in Cuba. Except at Cuba, they're going to Europe, they're going to Central and South America. And there's been a huge number of Cubans hitting Mexico. So, Dominican Republic, a lot of them are actually going to Russia, because University of Moscow is recruiting from the Dominican Republic and giving free tuition, especially in engineering and mathematics. So the brain drains are happening all over the world, just that we think it all happens here. So, turn to a colleague and discuss this. Do you see these changes? Do you agree with these statistics? And who are your kids? Turn and talk to partners. As we go through the rest of the presentation, keep in mind your own schools and your own districts, okay, and what's going on. So, question, does everyone agree as to what translanguaging is? Absolutely not. There is a huge debate that's been going on for about 50 years now. Okay? So let's take a look at this. There are various theories of translanguaging which are debated across different fields of study. They argue about it in linguistics, they argue about it in applied linguistics, they argue about it in anthropology and sociology. There's this constant arguing about language. Okay? So one debate is that what they call dual correspondence theory versus unitary theory. Sounds pretty fancy, right? It's really easy. Are there two language systems in our brains, or is there one? That's what the debate is. In other words, is our language knowledge based on more than one system? So before I have you turn to your partners, let's take a look at the three different points of view. Okay, first point of view, dual correspondence theory. In other words, let's say we have a student named Gene. He speaks English, French, and Portuguese, must live in Connecticut. Okay? Therefore, he has 3 different language systems that run parallel courses. In other words, he's got 3 different lines in his brain about language. And one of them is in French, one of them is in English, one of them is in Portuguese. And never the twain shall meet. That's one theory. Meaning every time you learn a language, it's a straight line of just that language. That's one theory. Then there's a unitary correspondence theory, which is also called the dual competence theory. This says that no, Gene's all 3 languages are part of one system. They're all in his brain together, and he knows when he's using them. So he's speaking French with a friend. Someone approaches him and asks him for directions in English, and he just turns around and keeps speaking English and explains the directions. Why? Because regardless of which of the 3 languages he's using, he's only thinking one thing, the directions. Then you have the third, what they call the integrated multilingual model. In other words, multilinguals have both shared and discrete systems. We have both. So while I'm learning French, I know French grammar. But then I can turn around and easily connect to my grammar in Spanish. But my brain knows that this is French and this is Spanish. Okay? Therefore, multilingualism is seen as universal, and each of us has multiple overlapping rule systems. How many people here speak more than one language? Do you mix up your grammars?
All the time.
Okay. So there's separate systems. But when you speak, do you keep going in the same grammatical area? Yeah, you ever hear your kids code switch?
All the time.
They all code switch in grammatically correct sentences. Mommy, yo voy para afuera que I'm going to play with my friends. It's grammatically correct. So the brain understands the grammatical rules, even though it's different languages. So these are the 3. So the question now I have for you is, which theory do you agree with? Do you think it's individual systems in your brain? Do you think it's one system that uses multiple languages, or do you think it's that integrated system? Think about it. Now turn and talk to someone you haven't spoken to. Introduce yourself to somebody different so you can get up and move and do what you have to do.
Let me get out of the camera angle.
Who would like to share something from your discussion? Who can share something from your discussion? Yeah.
I'm coming. Wait, I'm coming. I do have stilettos, but I'm really fast.
Hi. We were talking here about, she speaks Spanish also, and when you asked the question, do you mix up your grammar? And she said yes all the time, and you
Yeah.
looked at her kind of like, that wasn't the answer I was looking for. And I think there's a difference between someone who grew up speaking Spanish
Could be.
and someone who's learned it as a second language.
I think it's also, I reacted because of the difference of the meaning mix up.
Okay.
Because if you code switch, do you speak grammatically correct?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's what I think I meant. And that's a really good point. I'm glad you brought it up.
Okay.
What I meant by mixing up is, do you mix it up while you're speaking? I mean, confusion, yes, absolutely. We all confuse. Especially when I'm trying to figure out the difference between regular Spanish and academic Spanish.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But thank you for bringing that up. Absolutely, please continue, because I think you guys
Then
are
I was
right.
just going to say, you said that those diagrams are really easy. I don't understand them. Still, I'm looking at them and I'm thinking I've been with family who speak different Indian languages, and they forget I'm sitting in the room. I can't speak the languages, but they will talk to me in the language as if I'm one of the 6 people around the table, and I can understand what's going on and get the gist of the conversation. But then I feel like, no, I think it's the last model that people think in many different ways. And I'm an ESL teacher, and I'm just started last year trying to understand with being bilingual, being able to not just speak the language, but read the language. And we're having a lot of students come who are, and parents, who cannot read the language. You know, they can speak it, and the kids are having extra hard time in school because something hasn't transferred over. Like, I feel like if they learned it in their language, that could be transferred. But I don't know.
That's a good
It's just an
point.
observation.
And it also has to do with when we're speaking, and I'm going to add something else, another dimension to what you're talking about. It has to do with, am I speaking a language that I've actually been to school in? Is it an oral language? Remember that 70% of English learners in the United States are born in this country, which means they have never been to school in their own languages, so they never learned to read it. Or they came at a grade where they don't have the same academic level as they're covering in school. Now I'm going to add another dimension, students who come from oral languages that have no written component.
Oh, wait. I went the wrong direction.
Which is a huge growing group in the United States right now.
I just wanted to share something real quick. I have a 12-year-old son. He was nonverbal till he was 3, so I remember taking him to his pediatrician one time, and she asked me what language I spoke to him, and I told her I speak to him Spanish, because I told her when we were growing up in New Jersey, our parents were like Spanish at home, English at home, even though we spoke Spanglish, we both. So I when she told me that, I was kind of surprised. So my son's also epileptic, so I took him to his neurologist appointment. And I asked the neurologist, I said, hey, his pediatrician told me this. What do you think? She says, Juan, I speak 7 languages. I've never gotten confused. How many do you speak? I told her, I said, I speak 3. And she said, have you ever gotten confused? I told her, I said, no. She says, so just keep speaking Spanish to him. So he was nonverbal to the age of 5. Today he speaks Spanish, English, and Mandarin. And he reads and writes them also.
That's awesome. And that's actually a really good point, because some kids are just sometimes slow in processing. Okay, I was talking to one of your colleagues here. I have a friend, he speaks Japanese and Spanish. His wife speaks Chinese and Japanese, and they both speak English. And the one time his wife said something in Spanish to their daughter, she said, no, mommy, that's for daddy. Because in her mind, she separated who belongs where. So it's a lot of different things that come up. And like I said, one of the largest growing groups in this country are students who come from language systems that there's no written component. We've got kids coming from Guatemala who speak Garifuna, or they speak Quechua. And so there's no written component. Are they any less capable of understanding content? No. But we have to redefine our definition of literacy. So that's a really important thing. Plus, now we're getting a lot of indigenous speakers from Spanish-speaking countries who don't speak Spanish. I spoke to a teacher in Durango, Mexico, and he told me he has 18 indigenous languages in his room, and only 2 of them have a written component. So that's a really good point. I want to answer your question, but I also want to go back to this. The dual correspondence theory just says that each language system in the brain is separate from the other language systems. That's they use code switching as an explanation of that. That they only cross when something's missing. The unitary correspondence means that all the languages you learn are in one language system, and that your brain separates them as you use them. The integrated is pretty much close to the second one, except that it's saying that there are different branches, and that the brain understands that there are different grammatical systems to every language. So the grammatical system, let's say in Punjabi, is not the same as Urdu, or it's not the same as Russian. So, and you have Spanish, you said Chinese. So talk about 2 totally different systems, but are you thinking in both languages at the same time, where if someone speaks to you in that language, you'll recognize it immediately? That's what I'm breaking that up. Yes.
Sorry. Thanks. So as you were describing them, I'm kind of imagining each one of them as a category. And is it possible that, are we fitting students into them, or is it that like you need dual correspondence theory where they're learning the language, like a foundation, and then they can go to the next one, so that like the multilingual, the integrated model is almost like synthesis, where they're actually taking it and like bringing it into like a more complex.
It's possible. Like I said, these are all theories. They're all part of debates. And there's a lot out there. McSwain, who came up with this breakdown, never really talked about each one. Personally, yeah, I happen to think that when you're first learning a language, you're probably up here. And as I was telling your colleague, I happen to think this is a subsection of this. So I think they all are part together. My concern is, how do I take this and put it to work in the classroom? Because I love theory. I got to tell you, I can talk theory for months. But if I can't put it into practice in the classroom, it doesn't mean much. Theory is wonderful, but practice is the most important thing when you're talking about kids. And so we're going to look at these. And actually, I'm running low on time, right? So how much time do I have left? Okay, because then thinking about these things, I'm actually going to come back to this because I want to go a little bit more information. Is that okay with everybody before we do this? Okay, translanguaging is part of daily discourse. See, that's the other piece of translanguaging. We have the everyday discussion where languages come and go and people use languages for daily discourse. We also have it for pedagogical purposes. So what is it in daily discourse? It refers to language practices that a multilingual person uses. It includes discourse where the individuals speak to each other in one language or another. It includes simultaneous use of 2 or more languages, engaging everyone in conversation, whether they're familiar with the languages or not. I've like I said, I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, everybody's speaking Spanish. The Italian guy next door comes over, everybody starts speaking to him also, and he just jumps right in. And we don't even realize that we're saying words in any of the languages. So practice emphasizes the participants' flexible use of their complex resources. In other words, what do you have that you use? And here's the thing. When we're doing it in everyday life, we don't stop to think about it. We really don't, unless we're learning a brand new language and you stop someone. Wait a minute, can you say that again? Can you explain what you just said? But unless we lack comprehension, we really don't stop to think about it. It's sort of like, have you ever driven to work and not realized how you got there? You know, you're like, did I stop at that light back there? It's like kind of dangerous. Or like breathing. Unless you have trouble breathing, you don't think about it. Now everybody's going to go, okay, I'm breathing. But unless you have asthma or you're an athlete or you're, you know, for some reason having trouble breathing, we don't think about breathing. Unless you're deliberate about it. So everyday life. Multilinguals translanguage on a regular basis. We just do it. They connect with various languages based on the social setting and the situation. And that's actually very true. If I'm here in the States, I'm going to move back and forth between the 2 languages. If I'm back home in Puerto Rico, depending on what town I'm in, I may not speak English at all. Or if I'm in San Juan, I'll speak English and forget to speak Spanish, depending where I'm at on the island. So, and it depends on the other language groups that surround them. It also has to do, and this goes into what some of you were talking about, your command of conversational fluency. How much do you know? If I were to see a friend who's an Italian speaker, I could probably say, hi, how are you? And that's about it. I know that if he tells me he's good or bad, that's about it. Then I'll switch over back to English. So it really depends. So here's the Mendez family. They're preparing a holiday meal, so they decide, okay, we're all going to go together to the supermarket and buy what we need. Right? So we've got Abuela. You know, the grandson's like, Abuela, what fruit do you want? Oh, dame 2 limones, 3 naranjas. Raúl, get me some tomatoes. Just to switch over automatically. Okay, grandma, ¿cuántas libras? 3 libras. ¿Qué quiere el jamón? I don't know. There are a lot of people coming. And then he just switches over naturally. Raúl, búscame 5 libras. So they're just going back and forth. You know, we go from grandma, grandpa. Okay, now let's try mom and dad here. And they're like, okay, we're going to go get the meat. You're like, ¿qué quiere? Pollo, chuleta. The chicken's on sale. Let's go with that. Creo que debemos comprar jamón. He's like, Mare, I love ham. That just natural switch back and forth without thinking. Okay, he sees a cousin down on the other side. You know, he's like, yo, there's cacael. Oye, nena. Búscate los refrescos. And I was nice. I use the actual word for refresco. You know, if we were in New York, we would say, búscate la soda. You know, because just the way, you know, some parts of the United States we say soda, others say pop. Others say, you know, soft drinks. Same thing in all the other languages. We substitute depending where we come from. And she's like, está bien, I'll get Coke and water. See you at checkout. So it's all natural, back and forth. Did anybody stop there to say, oh, how do you say this? They just did it. And whatever they didn't know in one language, they just substituted for it in the other. Back and forth, very comfortable. That's daily translanguaging. It's just habit forming back and forth. But what about in school? Let's talk about this in school. Represents an approach to language instruction that affirms and leverages students' diverse and dynamic language practices in teaching and learning. In other words, we are deliberate in how we use language. Based on the work of Ofelia Garcia, who I consider the #1 guru of translanguaging, she didn't coin the term, but she might as well have. But it's that leveraging the student knowledge as a tool. And she's big on that thought. You know, it means that the teacher's aware that the linguistic capabilities of the student. So if I'm in my classroom, I know who can read and write in another language. I know who can have just oral conversations in another language. I know who needs to confirm one thing in one language and produce in the other. And that's what we have in a lot of our students. They comprehend in their home language, but they produce in English because they've always been to school in English. And they don't have a bridge between the two. And that bridge is what's important. Or if there is a bridge, it's pretty shaky. This also is the connection with our heritage speakers. Kids who are exposed to another language, but have never studied it, don't really know how to read and write in it, don't know how to have a formal discourse in it. Maybe they know a couple of words, they understand what grandma's saying at home, or they know who's gossiping about who, but if you ask them a question, they're going to answer you in English. So a teacher knows what they can tap into. That means really getting to know your kids. Now, elementary school, that's a little bit easier because if you got a 3rd grade class, you have a 3rd grade class the whole year. If you're in middle or high school, you may have anywhere from 100 to 200 kids, depending on the school you work in. But it's absolutely necessary to get to know our kids. Especially if the student is slight, a student with limited or interrupted formal education, meaning they've never been to school or their school is limited, or if they have a disability. Because we have to stop and think, what language are they processing in? Because guess what? Every single kid in your classroom is an English learner. Every single kid. Because no kid walks around speaking algebra. I have never been in a shopping mall in the food court and heard kids talking about the Pythagorean theorem. They don't. Market economies. Not even on Wall Street. So we need to know what the kids know. We need to know our kids. Is it easy? Heck no. I'm never going to tell you it's easy. Is it worth it? Absolutely. To stop and get to know our kids. At least superficially enough that we know where they're coming from and what are their capabilities. That's what a tier 1 classroom is, right? It's that universal system where we get to know every one of our kids. Okay, the important piece here is what I talked about. It's creating the bridge. And translanguaging allows you to create a bridge between two languages. We have one language that we're using to teach concepts and skills. That is the language of instruction. Then we have another language that becomes the scaffold to help you bridge between the two. So, for example, you want to do it deliberately. You want to be able to fix it. So during the lesson or at the close of the lesson or even the beginning, those concepts and skills are deliberately bridged to the student's other language. One really easy way of doing it, I used to send my kids homework. Homework was to teach your parents what I taught you today. Go home, teach your parents. Miss, my father doesn't speak English. I'm like, fine, teach him in Spanish. Teach him in Haitian. Teach him in Chinese. But I don't know the words. I'm like, Google. Don't you use Google for everything else? By the way, does everybody here know that Google actually is created in, I think it's 148, 150 languages. So all we have to really do is teach our children. I taught every single parent how to use the native language Google as if they were back home. So in Spanish, it's google.es. It's as if I'm in Latin America and I want to look up the solar system. It'll give me articles in Spanish as if I were living in Puerto Rico or in Haiti. Or in, well, China's kind of hard because China creates Google, Chinese Google, but it doesn't allow the people to use it. They use Bing. Check that one out. But you can use those systems. I'm like, well, look up the words. You got Google. And I taught the kids how to use google.es. I taught every parent. It was a tool to help create that bridge afterwards. You know, and used as active teaching methodology or as a student support system, that's up to you as a teacher. You know, instructional translanguaging is always used deliberately and strategically, just like in that example you read at the beginning. So Mrs. Carson, right, that science teacher that you read about before? I was laughing because one of you said that she's been teaching for 20 years. She just realized that she's got kids in her class who need support and need extra help. So she gave them a project where they have to create their own experiment. They have to create that lab report, you know, where they have to actually create an experiment. And she allows her students to use her home language as a scaffold. I got to tell you, personally, when I find something really difficult, I will annotate in Spanish. Why can't we let our kids do that? Why can't they annotate in their home language? It doesn't, the annotations are for them. And that's the whole thing. That has to do with actively teaching kids. How do you annotate? Not just highlight everything. You ever get the kid who highlights everything? You want to cure that? Ask them to explain in the margin why they highlighted. The kid who's a smart aleck is like, oh, I'm not doing that. And the kid who really doesn't understand starts figuring out why they're highlighting things and why it's important. But why can't they do it in their home language? I had a kid who wrote in traditional Chinese. And he annotated everything in Chinese. The only deal was that if I went up to him and asked him what it said, he had to explain what it said in English. Because I don't speak Chinese. Okay? So she allows them to annotate. She allows them to outline. She allows them, you know, they have to produce in the language of instruction. That's the law. So first drafts and outlines. And this is a really important piece. They create drafts and outlines in their home language as a study guide. They don't translate word for word. They take that information, they synthesize it. By the way, isn't that part of Bloom's taxonomy? Don't we have to synthesize information? So synthesize it and then create it in English. Problem with that is that in this world of Google Print, kids don't know how to do that, and we have to teach them how to do it, regardless of what language we're using. Okay, which programs best lend themselves to translanguaging? Well, we've got general education tier 1, right? Which includes kids who are eligible for EL services, but not yet met exit criteria. Students who have reached proficiency levels as per state language proficiency assessments, but have to be monitored for 4 years. English proficient students who come from bilingual homes, students whose parents have opted out of English language support systems. Those are the hard ones. Because the parents say, no, they won't learn English, but then they won't learn English because they have nothing connecting. Okay, in these instances, we use it as a strategy for supporting students, helping them out. Okay, their home language becomes a viable resource academically. Here's a good example. Mr. Arroyo is reviewing the stages of the water cycle. He's got 28 kids in his class. That's a nice number. It's a little on the high side, but still manageable, right? 28. I remember when we used to have 35 to 40 kids in the class. Okay, he's got 10 native English speakers, 5 current EL students, 6 former Ls, 5 bilingual Spanish and Portuguese students, 2 students whose parents opted out. That's a pretty mixed class. So what does he do to translanguage? He presents the different stages of the water cycle on a diagram. He identifies the name of each stage in English. He asks kids, hey, do you know the cognates? Are there words here that sound like something in your home language? Evaporation, condensation, precipitation. I mean, come on. Those are the ultimate cognates in both Portuguese and Spanish. Okay, gives a short explanation in their home languages, so each one gets like a video clip in their own language, discusses the Latin roots of these cognates. Then he creates heterogeneous groups where the kids will do a human timeline activity with multilingual cards. You ever do timeline? Anybody ever do timeline? Yep, you give kids signs and they have to put themselves in order, which means they have to argue it out. So they can argue in any language they want, as long as they get in the right order. Okay, where else do we use it? How about an ESL? English as a second language class, or ELD classes. We keep changing the names to the same thing. You ever notice that? ELD, ESL, ELL, they're all the same class. They're learning English. Okay, so, when we're talking about this, a really important that the language of instruction has to be English. So if we're going to translanguage, we have to be very deliberate and knowledgeable about it. Even if the language of instruction is English, the teacher can still provide that support, that sense. It's a scaffold. And what's the most important part of a scaffold? Removing the scaffold. It's okay, I gave you a lot of Spanish to help you out. Now I'm going to take it away, little by little, until you're only working in English. So the ESL teacher or the general ed teacher working in an ESL program can set up a collaborative structure. I was a push-in teacher. I did collaborative team teaching, where I went in and I co-taught. I was in charge of language, the other teacher was in charge of content, and we worked together. We planned together, and that's the most important piece. So we want to interact with content concepts. We want kids working, learning, interacting with content. First time I said to a kid, I need you to interact with the book. He thought I was crazy. But the fact of the matter is they have to interact with content. They have to manipulate it and work with it. So here's another example. This is a 6th grade ESL sheltered math teacher, Mrs. Mann. She's teaching a lesson on GEMDAS. Is Pennsylvania using GEMDAS or PEMDAS still? PEMDAS and GEMDAS are the same thing. PEMDAS, the P stands for parentheses. GEMDAS is for any graphic. So it's parentheses, brackets, the constants. But that's coming. It's going across the entire country. So she's got 16 kids, 9 Spanish speakers, 4 Somali speakers, and 3 Tagalog speakers. Now, for some teachers, that would be a nightmare. Students range from level 1 through level 4. Let's talk about more of a nightmare. As per district and state mandates, language of instruction is English. So she's using SIOP. Students have to read a word problem, identify the operation they would need to solve the problem, create an equation, and then solve the equation. They also have to create a short presentation that explains it. That seems like a lot of work, right? Level 1 kids, going to have a hard time with this. Teacher broke the groups into language groups. Levels 1 and 2 were homogeneous. Levels 3 and 4 were heterogeneous. They can use their home language for discussions, for annotations and group works. We made sure they had bilingual math glossaries and dictionaries, so they can use home language terms. Each group creates a poster, and then they're going to explain the poster in English. But they're working together. They're having their discussions. They can talk in Tagalog. I have no problem with that. But when you present, you need to explain it in English. That's a lot of bridging back and forth. That's a lot of language back and forth. But it can work. So that if the AP walks in to observe, they're going to hear the kids doing the presentations in English. Have them do it on Flipgrid first. They can go on Flipgrid, do it in their home language, and then translate. In that case, you need to translate because it's oral interpretation. Transitional bilingual ed. Less and less states in the United States are using transitional bilingual ed, but it is still a viable option where they are learning content in the home language until they are capable of doing the work in English. So translanguaging allows the teachers to actually adjust the language throughout the year so that you are transitioning from one language to another. So I can start in the home language, and by the end of the year, the kids are going to be working in English. So translanguaging builds connections. The entire time in transitional is bridging. A lot of people think that because you teach the content in the home language that the kids don't get ESL. Law says you have to have ESL. You have to have that transition into English. And it's very strategic. Okay, the job of translanguaging here is not only to facilitate the transition from the home language to the target language, but it also transfers language and literacy. So what I know how to do in reading, writing, speaking, and listening in my home language, I'm going to connect it to English. Because if I know how to solve the Pythagorean theorem in Spanish, I can do it in English. I just need the vocabulary. If I understand photosynthesis in Chinese, I'm going to understand it in English. I just need the vocabulary. I need somebody to bridge the two for me. And the only way to do that is through translanguaging. So here's an example. Yes, this is me. This is my 7th grade American history class. We covered topics, got to tell you, started the Age of Exploration straight through Reconstruction era. It's a lot of work in 1 year in the 7th grade. I had 28 kids in the class, all beginning school year. I was very lucky with this group. They were all intermediate through advanced. I didn't have any beginners that year. That was a rarity that I thank God for every day. The semester began. All content was covered 90% in Spanish. Started the year off. Everything was in Spanish. Brought in a lot of videos. Brought in a lot of visuals. Brought in a lot of work. I taught my parents how to use the Google. Bridged everything back and forth. The whole room looked like an experiment on labeling in multiple languages. Used the glossaries. Okay, I worked with the ESL teacher. Unfortunately, our schedules didn't allow us to co-teach, but she front-loaded everything for me. And we co-planned, and we worked together, and she spoke with the kids, and I worked with the kids. And so the students were encouraged to use both languages. Whatever language you were comfortable in, that's the one you could take notes in. I gave them copies of the PowerPoints, Because what do EL students do? They spend so much time copying down the PowerPoint information that they don't understand what you're covering. So I gave them copies of the PowerPoints, and they annotated the PowerPoints as we spoke in whatever language they wanted to. By the end of the year, we were covering all 85 to 90% of the work in English because we kept transitioning and bridging. And here's the funny part. The kids really didn't pick up on the fact that we were using more of the English every day throughout the year. We just did it. So that's in transitional, bilingual, and in immersion. Dual language. There's a lot of controversy about using translanguaging and dual language because you're not supposed to introduce the other language, especially if you're a 50-50 program. But you can use it as a support, as a scaffold, and you're very strategic because you're not going to use it a lot. You're only going to use it when it's absolutely necessary. So, and by the way, those of you who've been taking pictures, I did upload the PowerPoint along with the handouts that you have. So you can download the PowerPoint slides as a handout. So you have these examples to look at. Okay, and what these two teachers did in this example, oh, I want to talk about that. Benefits of translanguaging and dual language. Why do I do it? I build on the metalinguistics, on the thinking. You have to teach the kids how to think about their thinking. So this allows this to work on it. Students' recognition that they can use their languages strategically and enables comprehension and production as they bridge between the two. Students' awareness and validation of the role language plays in their everyday lives. We're validating their home language. And if I feel validated, I'm going to work harder. Benefits also include the ability to address multilingual audiences and negotiate meeting. In other words, I can go home and teach my mother what I just learned in English. And it provides the resources that they need and get them to that abstract thinking level. Experimentation and interaction. They get to actually talk to other people in multiple languages. So here's an example. Ms. Ramirez and Mr. Simmons, they're side-by-side partners in a 50-50 dual language program. The school decided we are going to spend in your grade this year, the whole year, we're going to look at compare and contrast, drawing conclusions, inferencing for second grade Gs, sequencing, classification, predicting, and synthesizing information. That particular school, synthesizing was at every grade. Each class are going to pick 5 books. They're going to read them. They're going to teach these skills through the 5 books. The first book, Ms. Ramirez and Mr. Simmons decided, even though it's not recommended, they decided the first book, they're going to do the same book in both languages. Anybody here ever read Why Mosquitoes Buzz in People's Ears? Absolutely great book. It's in about 10 or 12 different languages. Really great. It's one of those build upon sequencing books. You know, like he did this, so he did that, he did it, and you take them right through. Absolutely great book. It won the Caldecott Award and several other awards. It's in English, Why Mosquitoes Buzz in People's Ears. In English, Porque zumban los mosquitos en los oídos de la gente. It's a really great book. They decided we're going to start the year off with the same book. So they both read the same book in the respective languages. They taught about sequencing. And as the unit proceeds, they choose different books. They move away. But the first one they do together. The kids learn the books. They learn about sequencing. They create a reader's theater where the kids created masks and stuff of the different animals in the books. And then they did the reader's theater, the English speakers presenting it in Spanish to the Spanish speakers and the Spanish speakers presenting it in English to the English speakers. A lot of fun. After that, they shifted away, did different books, but every time did the same skills. So they both did compare and contrast at the same time. They wanted to make sure that the skills were taught right through. So think about a lesson you've taught or observed lately. Okay? Were there opportunities in that lesson when you could have translanguaged? Could using the student's home language have actually improved your lesson or helped the kids in the lesson? And if you did actually allow them to use their home language, how did it work? Turn and talk to your partner. Who would like to share your thoughts? Let's get a couple of other people. I hate voluntold. So let's get a couple of volunteers to share your thoughts on this, or things you've done or might want to do. We'd like to try and do a little bit of sharing. Let me start with what you guys were just talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. So Jen and I were talking as consultants for Patton, and I didn't introduce myself, and I realized a long time ago. Hi, I'm Maria, by the way. I am your English learner state lead at Patton, and there's a program that's running at some schools, Story Champs. If you haven't heard about it yet, talk to Dr. Collins in the back. But it's a really exciting thing for school where it's narrative based. And with a lot of metacognition in between to be able to enhance literacy and language in all 4 domains. And so she was pointing out to me, she said, hey, translanguaging would be an awesome scaffold to be able to work with the language learners in a tier 1 setting in the classroom to be able to extend their knowledge. So inviting that language into that space to build on their language skills. So I thought it was an awesome suggestion. So anything, though, I know as an ELD specialist myself that you're having questions about, because I know you're sitting there because you're thinking of your level 1s and 2s and thinking, how does that work in my classroom? Anybody have any questions? Yeah, I see. Come on. We are a tenacious group, and y'all aren't speaking up. So I know you got something you want to say. So we'll bring it back there. What do you want to say?
Wait for me. I know I'm slow, but still.
So I support MTSS in the schools within the district of Philadelphia. And in one of the biggest concerns that I hear from teachers is also they don't have enough exposure or experience professionally with language instruction. And so that's one of the things that they want to be coached on. And then another is, like, we were back here sharing, like, what's the best practice? Because I hear Google translation is not a best practice, and because it doesn't translate over into how it's pronounced. And then it's like, well, what is the best case scenario that we can give teachers so that they feel like they have something tangible to support the learners, because they just feel frustrated for them, and in a way then they just get paralyzed, and the support they get frustrated and almost like, not that they stop, but it's kind of like, well, what do you want me to do? And they just throw their hands up. So it's like, are there any tangible tools that, like, this is supporting my background knowledge and helping me to evolve, but I'm also wondering, how can I then take this and help them evolve, because right now they're not ready for this yet. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Because I feel like if I were to present this to them, this is like a phase 3 where they're like, first, like, wait, what do you want me to do? And how do you want me to support my level 1s? Because one school in Philly is 60% level 1. Yeah. And parents are coming to them, and another school is that they're checking the box white because they do not see themselves categorized in any of the descriptions that are there.
That's a problem that's coming up in a lot of places, and a lot of people, most Latinos will either mark themselves white or other. And it's really, really hard. Even I have a hard time. I really have to think about it.
So then, thinking of data and how we need to disaggregate our data, how are they, like, teachers are wondering, like, am I getting a true read on the way that it's broken, like, because that's how it's broken down even in the future index. Like and so that's like one of the conversations that we're having now, that was something that was brought up by one of the schools. So, like, it's like a bell curve of of issues. I just dumped a lot, but there are things I'm hearing.
You start with student comprehension of content, honestly. Translations sometimes work, but you have to be careful. You got to remember that there are 21 countries in the world that use Spanish as their primary language, and each one speaks Spanish differently. So for a good example of that is the word ahorita. In the Caribbean, in Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, and Cuba, ahorita means later. Te veo ahorita, I'll see you later. In Mexico and Central America and parts of South America, ahorita means right now, this second. Holy moly, imagine two kids arguing about something. You know, and when I go to Mexico, I always get laughed at because I use the word ahorita wrong. In my classroom, I actually forbade the word. They said, no, you have to say después or ahora, that's it. Because they would get into arguments. Or something, you know, that's funny is that something that might be an everyday word in one Spanish country is a curse in another. So you have to be careful back and forth. So you can't just use, Google Translate. There was a teacher that I worked with who did a Google Translate of a letter going home to the parents about something that was happening in the fall. Google translated it as falling over, and the parents all started calling up the teacher like, who's falling down? What's going on? Is my child in trouble? And it had to do with an activity that was going to go on in the fall because the translation is not correct. Same thing using books that are translated. Well, two things wrong with that. If you use a translated book, it depends what country translates. Most textbooks translate in Argentina. And our kids, most of them are not from Argentina. 90% of them are not from Argentina. The other thing is readability changes. I had supposedly in English, a biology book that was at an 8th grade reading level. The minute you translated that book, it was college level. So you have to be careful readability. I'll give you an even easier one, Harry Potter. Harry Potter is a 4th to 6th grade readability, book 1. And she did that on purpose. Every book goes up 2 reading levels throughout the book. But book 1, which is a 4 to 6, once you translate it, it's a 6 to 8. Even I had to sit down with a bilingual dictionary while I was reading Harry Potter. Because by the time you got to book 7, you were doing graduate work, the level of Spanish. So you have to really stop and think. That's why translation doesn't work. But that doesn't mean the kids can't be allowed to have the discussion in their home language and annotate. Those are 2 very simple things. They can draw pictures and label it in their home language, then learn the English word and start using both. You start with very little pieces. You start small and then build. And what I said, use, things that the parents might be able to help out with the kids. Teach the parents how to use Google.es. Or whichever one they have in Portuguese. And be careful with Portuguese because Brazilian Portuguese and Portuguese are 2 different languages, almost. And they don't talk to each other. So we can't get help there.
Can I offer some support?
Absolutely. Go for it.
So Caller in Colorado. Oh, jeez Louise.
Colorado,
Caller in Colorado sometimes has good information on there, some good advice for regular ed, gen ed teachers.
Absolutely.
WIDA, our state, also has a lot of stuff. And then ELD portal has changed. It's now on SAS. They have a lot of documents on there also that have been translated. So when you have parent-teacher conferences, I try to reiterate to my gen ed teachers, can you please ask and put the mark interpreter needed kind of thing, and I've have it translated into many different languages, and it's all from on that portal. And they also offer tons of classes that gen ed teachers can take just to understand your newcomers in your classroom or your level 1s and tier 2. So I offer a lot of that to the gen ed teachers, are the free classes that kind of come with that they can take at any time. So that's just some extra support.
What was the first one that you said?
Caller in Colorado.
Colorín Colorado. That's an actually fantastic website because they also have articles and videos that can be shared with parents. And the other is the CUNY Graduate Center in New York City, City University of New York Graduate Center. They have an entire division run by Ofelia Garcia on translanguaging. And on their website, they have tons of curriculum support materials, and they have videos. And I highly recommend that. They're actually on the reference list you have on the handouts, on the references.
I think we have one more
That's it.
comment. And then
Yep.
I think we're
We're done.
Just on the note of Philadelphia, a marriage between MTSS and UDL, particularly principles of universal design for learning, I think marry very well with translanguaging, giving kids universal access to grade level core instruction, no matter what so you design it for everybody. So we brought ties in, they're presenting all day today, you might catch their last session, but everything will be posted.
There's so many good ones in the last session.
So, thank you. If you want part 2 of Translanguaging, join us. We'll be moving over to Rose. So we're moving over. So hopefully we'll see you over there. Yep, thank you.